Today, on the Mr. Maple podcast, Matt and Tim discuss their recent trip to the Oregon State Archives with their mentor, Talon Buchholz, to tour the archives of J.D. Vertrees.
Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. Today we've got an interesting podcast for you. We're going to be recapping a little bit of things we found at the Oregon State Archives. We recently went on a trip with our friend and mentor, Talon Buchholz, and we toured some of these archives of famous nurseryman and author J.D. Vertrees. I'm Matt, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show.
Hey guys, I'm Tim, and make sure you hit that like button if you're watching this on our YouTube. Guys, make sure you subscribe to us and you give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. That just helps us a long ways and more people finding our podcast. Guys, we're MrMaple.com. We're a family mail order business. We ship directly to your door. We do over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maples. So if you appreciate this type of content, please shop with us on MrMaple.com.
Guys, if you're a Japanese maple person, you know who J.D. Vertrees is. We have a special walkthrough Wednesday coming soon. It's going to take us a second to edit this one, but we actually went and filmed in the gardens of J.D. Vertrees himself. The property is currently owned by Stuart Wilson. He's in the process of selling again, but Stuart's taken immaculate care of these grounds. He was the owner after J.D. Vertrees passed, and we look forward to showing you firsthand J.D. Vertrees' private Japanese maple collection. Something we took, we bought plane tickets and flew out to shoot. I think you're going to enjoy that one. You can find that one on YouTube. It should be in the works by the time this airs. It'll be an up-and-coming video. Guys, J.D. Vertrees really helped popularize Japanese maples in America and all around the world. I mean, this is he wrote the first English book describing Japanese maples in detail. Before this, there were many books in Japanese and Chinese and Romanji and Kanji and all these different languages. But this is really the first accumulation of cultivar data for English-speaking countries. And it's groundbreaking. It really paved the way for what I do. So he opened a doorway that, we're still walking through today. And with his first edition of Japanese maples, it really just started things off, and it made this easy and palatable for the home gardener. It gave them, the Japanese Maple Bible. They could pick this up. They could look through cultivars. They could dream of new selections. And it really opened people up to the idea that there's more than a red and a green one.
On a personal level, Matt and I, we grew up selling Japanese maples at tailgate markets. And if you know anything about selling at tailgate markets, there's a lot of time you have sitting slow. And you're sitting there a long time waiting for someone to walk up to talk them into buying a Japanese maple that they didn't plan on purchasing until they walked up. And so we would sit there and read J.D. Vertrees' book. And what Japanese maples, the first edition, second edition, third edition, each of those editions became to us was a wealth of knowledge, but also our wish list. I mean, that is where we learned about all these different cultivars and the history behind them. And that's one of the things that started off our passion with Japanese maples, was digging into this book. And it was such a wealth of knowledge. J.D. Vertrees had already passed by the time Matt and I really got into.
Yeah, I believe he passed in the early 90s. Our dad actually probably benefited a lot from the trading that Bob Bullington and even guys like J.C. Ralston were doing with Bob Bullington through J.D. Vertrees at the time. Dad was growing Japanese maple cultivars, grafting them himself in the early 90s before J.D. Vertrees passed. And so some of his cultivars may even come from there. We bought this one online. This is a first edition copy, and it's actually signed by J.D. Vertrees. So we have all of the authors of the main books. Peter Gregory, good friend of ours, who did the third and fourth edition of Japanese maples, as well as the pocket guide, and J.D. Vertrees himself, who did the first and second edition. So we have all those signed, which is kind of cool too.
And we actually have 2 Vertrees signed, so that you've got a copy and I've got a copy, which is pretty amazing. But J.D. Vertrees means a lot to us because of that. I mean, he is one of the things that helped instill this passion. I mean, we grew out our gardening passion from our grandmother. We got our love for Japanese maples from our dad. And then digging more into Japanese maples, there wasn't a lot of things online that you could find about Japanese maples back in the day. I mean, you really had to work hard, and books were where you dug into to learn about these Japanese maples.
We were doing
And
this before the internet.
so,
Believe it or not, we're young guys, but our
did,
passion for Japanese maples is pre-internet era, and you couldn't just click on Mr. Maple and read a lot of the stuff, and so you had to really dig around and do your research. We also feel a kinship. You know, you'll see this in our video that we filmed on Vertrees grounds, but we grew up before we ever had a nursery. My parents moved onto our street before Dad was growing Japanese maples, and our street is named Maplewood Knoll. J.D. Vertrees famously had Maplewood nurseries. Felt a little bit of feelings when we pulled onto Maplewood Lane, pulling into J.D. Vertrees' home. It's like it kind of felt a little bit of kinship just having the same road name there. But a very cool thing. And basically, what we did that we want to present to you guys, we want more information than the book has. We love that stuff. We're plant geeks. And so another legendary plantsman, equal to Vertrees in importance, is Talon Buchholz, guys. And so we were spending some time with Talon before he retires in Oregon. We filmed a lot of content at his place that you'll love. But we took Talon and we went to the Oregon State Archives. Now, the archives have some of the original information from J.D. Vertrees when he was preparing Japanese Maples first edition for Timber Press. Full disclosure, Stuart Wilson has actually given us boxes beyond boxes of more information that J.D. Vertrees left in his home. We have boxes of information that was in his basement there. And so we have our own little archives here at Mr. Maple of content. And a special thank you to Stuart Wilson. What a kind man. He really understood the importance of this garden. When he got the garden, it actually said in his contract to preserve the plant collection of J.D. Vertrees. And he has been, I mean, what a good person to keep this thing going. And so kind with his time and information for us. So special thanks to Stuart Wilson on this as well for sending us further information. But what we want to talk about a little bit today is we went there with Talon Buchholz to Oregon State, and we went through a lot of the personal notes and archives of J.D. Vertrees. And there's a lot of interesting correspondence in these guys. There's a lot of notes to early nurseries. There's a lot of notes to Dick Wolf, to D.M. Van Gelderen, to John Isley, to all these very influential nursery people who've really defined Japanese maples in America and in the world. And they've really helped popularize this whole thing. And we owe them a great debt of gratitude. But there was some interesting little tidbits we found in these archives as well. Again, a lot of them are personal letters from J.D. Vertrees. And I think so much is missed. How cool is that? Like, you know, I don't think anybody's going to be going through Tim and I's text messages one day to somebody else. It's so cool because these guys have detailed correspondence. And they have, you know, if he wrote, say, for instance, he wrote a letter to Ed Wood. You probably heard us talk about Ed Wood on this podcast before. Influential nursery guy. It would have his correspondence as well as the letter sent back stapled to the back. So you'd kind of have this little personal letter and rapport between the two. And you could kind of really get a grasp for J.D. Vertrees as a man and as a person, the way he talked to other people in his letters. And it was pretty candid. I really enjoyed it. I really thought we got a bigger picture of J.D. Vertrees overall, especially not being a contemporary of his.
And that was some of our goals going into this. I mean, one of our goals is we never met J.D. Vertrees. So who was J.D. Vertrees? I mean, we've read the book, The Man, the Myth, the Legend, but when he's corresponding with these people, who is he? How does he treat people? You know, there's a lot about that. And then there's, on top of that, it's what information is in these notes that's not in the books. And we found some really cool information. And then lastly, Matt and I were trying to look for the 1710 list translated from ancient Japanese to current Japanese. And
he has some copies of that out there. So we're going to be doing an upcoming 1700s Japanese maple podcast with Dr. Murray for you extra geeky plant maple history nuts. You're going to love this one. It's a work of passion because it's taken a lot of work to get all this stuff together. It's something we've been working on for years as well as Dr. Murray. But I hope you'll enjoy that upcoming 1700s list podcast. I think that one's going to be really interesting. There was a lot of information that kind of helped us with that in this as well. But we're just going to go over some of the things, our findings from the archives with J.D. Vertrees, and just give you a little bit more about him and what he was doing.
So we spent a total of 8 hours at the archives this time. We'd spent about an hour and a half before.
We literally
on a
got there when it
previous trip.
opened, and we left when it closed. I think Corbin, who was our video man, thought we were nuts. He's sitting there like, you guys still looking through boxes of papers? But yeah.
So we're the extreme tree geeks who are digging into the papers, trying to learn and see if there's more we can learn about the trees from this. But it was such an amazing time, especially because when we talked about doing this, Talon Buchholz, who he bought his nursery grounds from J.D. Vertrees' sister.
How cool is that?
And Vertrees was someone who taught him a lot. I mean, Talon Buchholz considers J.D. Vertrees the mentor. And
he told us while we're sitting there, he's like, I have the ghost of J.D. Vertrees over my shoulder saying, don't screw this up, kid. And I mean, you're talking to Talon. Talon's retiring soon. You're talking about a well-seasoned guy. And he's like, I've never a day not had the ghost of J.D. Vertrees with me saying, hey, get your nomenclature right. Don't screw this up, kid. And so it's just kind of fun to get that little personal anecdote. And on another side note, and if you ever watch our podcast where we interviewed Talon, we certainly shared a kinship with him about this. I think J.D. Vertrees could be a little short with some people, but he really spent time with Talon and poured into him. And I laugh because Talon and us have a similar relationship where Talon's a no-nonsense old school guy, but he's really been amazing at sharing information to us. So it made it extra special to be in the archives, but man, to be there with Talon Buchholz going through stuff and seeing what interested him in the notes and kind of talking to him about different things. I mean, he was contemporary of these guys. So when we talk about Ed Wood or, you know, the different people that he was corresponding with, he's like, oh yeah, I used to do business with him. And, you know, we got all these little interesting tidbits from Talon while we're going through there. I'm literally picking up a piece of paper, scanning it for information that I want, whether it be cultivar related or, you know, just key information related. And Talon's giving me the whole backstory behind it. Oh yeah, he bought his nursery from this guy, and oh, he cheated him, and this was the deal on that, and oh, that fell through, and we never would do business with them. And so I'm getting all the good inside dirt from him on everything as we're going through there. He actually shipped trees to J.D. Vertrees, so we're hoping to find those purchase logs for him too, which would just be cool. But there was some correspondence with Buchholz early on there as well.
So the very first thing we did was we went through some correspondence basically around the time the book was starting to come out in the 1970s. And when we first started going through this, it's a lot of customer interactions because J.D. Vertrees is staying very busy. And it was very funny because it reminded us of a lot of our customer emails.
Right. Same nursery problems, different decades, right? I mean, it's funny. It's like, he's like, hey, we had a really rough winter. I'm writing to you that my graft yield wasn't as good as last year. I'm writing to you to let you know our refund policy on the tree. I'm writing to you to let you know that, you know, we may not have that in stock next year because we've discontinued. It was hilarious to us to look at the similarities and can you identify this plant? I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, he's getting a handwritten postcard with a green seedling on it in 71. And it says, can you identify the name of my cultivar? I'm like, man, if he only knew this will never end.
He was so kind. He was writing letters directly back to those people and saying,
2023, we're still getting the same email.
He was writing the letters back and saying, you know, unfortunately, from these 2 leaves, I cannot identify your tree. You know, many trees are hard to identify once the tags
Please
are
send
off
us some
the
fall
plant.
color pictures, and maybe we can help better give you a guesstimation.
I have a large tree in my yard. How much is it worth?
Oh man, the kinship with this guy on his customer correspondence were hilarious. So it's like, man.
And he was writing full page letters back to these people on many of these questions. And I was just like, oh my goodness, he's taking this much time.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And I mean, we're talking typewriters. I mean, all this is typewriter correspondence. And it was amazing to see. But then we started looking through and seeing really interesting people. And it became the who's who of plants and the who's who of maples when you're looking through J.D. Vertrees' correspondence.
Yeah, I had so much fun checking this out. Of course, you always find the good stuff right when the clock's running down. So I think the last hour of our time there, I got into the alphabetical Van Gelderen and Dick Wolf box. And I'm like, dang, that was a good one. I probably should have started with the DM Van Gelderen Dick Wolf box. There were tons of gold in there, but there was so many interesting tidbits of information I found along the way. You know, we're good friends with Les Fujigami. He is the inventor of Nature Shield, and he was helping JD Vertrees' work on a lot of the early translations and getting him information in Japanese and contacts in Japan. Uh, it was really interesting because JD Vertrees, he did his work. Like this guy was corresponding with people in Dallas and he was checking on the heat tolerance of plants. He was corresponding with people in Minnesota, talking about the cold tolerance, talking about the possibilities of hybrids with Amur maples to Japanese maples to make them work in Minnesota. He was really going through and doing his due diligence and really talking to a lot of people in Japan and the UK and all over the world through letter form. It was so interesting to see that because there was a lot of valuable information in that, not only personal wise, but also cultivar wise. So he has distinctions where he says, I believe this may be the same, or, don't waste your time on that one. It's a weakling, things like that. Stuff that we love to see as nurserymen.
Now, one of the people he corresponded with a lot was J.C. Ralston. And J.C. Ralston is now what the North Carolina Arboretum is known and named for. It's now the J.C. Ralston Arboretum at NC State University. And J.C. Ralston had this mentality of anywhere you stand in the garden, you need to be able to see another Japanese maple. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about a true Japanese maple aficionado corresponding back and forth with JD Vertrees, talking about the plants they love, talking about when they're going to get to hang out and visit the next time they see each other, when J.C. Ralston's next sabbatical is going to be so they can hang out.
On a personal note, what's cool about that is Ralston was sending things to Bob Bullington, and a lot of those were getting to my dad. So my dad was trading with Bob Bullington and some other people who locally in Hendersonville, and that's how some of those early cultivars, my dad, he had 50 cultivars in the 90s, and that's kind of how a lot of that got into North Carolina and got started, would be via J.C. Ralston to Bob Bullington, and it kind of got things, or Robert Jackman here locally that was trading with Dad, and those guys were reaching out and talking to J.D. Vertrees as well. So it's kind of cool to be semi-contemporary through our dad too.
And also locally in North Carolina, we had Charlie Keith, and he had the Keith Arboretum in Chapel Hill. Mm-hmm. And the Keith Arboretum in Chapel Hill is known for its species maples and its species plants. And it has some of the most amazing species. In fact, our Acer olivaceum that we've offered before on MrMaple came to Dr. Charlie Keith, to his Arboretum, via JD Vertrees. And we're sitting here reading letters back and forth about about his purchases from JD Vertrees and about how he's sending certain species that JD Vertrees doesn't have to JD so that he could propagate them and learn about them. And just seeing these letters back and forth from back in the day, we're talking 1960s to 1970s, with Dr. Charlie Keith and JD Vertrees, was pretty spectacular for us.
Yeah, he was really pushing the envelope. Like, not only was he personally putting together the first English book on, nomenclature and cultivars of Japanese maples, he was trying to advance things in every way possible. When I say he was writing to people in Texas, he was talking to them about, this might work for you. You need to think about this. He was writing to people in Minnesota and saying, let's see if this works for you. And he was really trying to expand things. I mean, I saw a lot of notes to Ed Wood, who was a famous seedling grower and grew many cultivars like Woods No. 2, what later became Al Jaton with Talon Buckholtz as Woods No. 1. And, he was very influential on Talon as well, but he was writing to him saying, we got to get more seeds. You got to be growing more seeds. We got to go through more Acer japonicums. There can be more selections made of this. So he was really encouraging the entire industry. I found some interesting notes to Al Munn, who was a regional park and recreational guy. And that's Carl Munn's dad, guys. That's the guy who named Moonrise his father. And he was a regional parks and recreation guy. So he had all the hookups for the seeds. So Vertrees is writing him and saying, guys, we got to get more seeds going on these Acer sercinatums. We got to get more Japanese maple seeds in production. How can we be going through more genetics? So not only was he, organizing things, he was also cheerleading a lot of these guys in, let's look through more stuff. Let's find more cool things.
One of the cool letters that Matt and I ran across was his correspondence with Dr. Monroe. And if that name means anything to you, Monroe, it should, because you might have seen the cultivar Acer sercinatum Monroe. Now, Acer sercinatum Monroe was found in the wild in the Pacific Northwest by Dr. Monroe as a more lace leaf variety of Acer sercinatum. Mm-hmm. And this is a sercinatum that we offer on MrMaple. It is very unique in its habit, but the leaf shape is especially unique for being Acer sercinatum.
Yeah, he really liked Acer, sercinatum, Monroe. And I think, my understanding and the way I read some of those letters, he really liked one that Dr. Warner Monroe found this. He liked this guy a lot. So he really liked sending out the tree with Monroe's name on it and just kind of honoring him through that. But I also think he was kind of playing around with the idea of these are native Japanese maples to my area. I mean, they're not Japanese maples. They're, Acer sercinatum is compatible with palmatum, and it was grown indigenously there in the Pacific Northwest. So he's kind of going, okay, this one's got some next level traits. Let's get it everywhere and then look through the seeds. So I think part of the dream was developing more future sercinatum cultivars by sending this all over. I looked at correspondence where he sent this at least 20 different places, in the Pacific Northwest, saying, guys, put this out in honor of Dr. Monroe. And, he's getting those genetics out there for variability for sure.
And I actually ran across a letter to Mrs. Monroe, Dr. Monroe's wife. And he actually in there talks about how great of a man he thought Dr. Monroe was, how amazing he was, and how he hopes that this sercinatum can be his, part of his legacy, and that this can really honor him.
That's really cool. He really paid a lot of respects to the guys he thought were before him. I mean, this guy wrote the book, and he's still giving everybody credit and really trying to. He was very timid to name plants, especially himself, but he really liked naming trees and getting trees out there that were named for people he liked.
So as we're going through this, we even see letters from Pat McCracken, who's a good friend of ours. Good friend of ours. And Pat's correspondence with J.D. Vertrees. And here we've got Pat's handwritten writing, which I can barely read, and then looking through and reading the correspondence back and forth and understanding how much Pat...
We'll have to get Pat to translate that, like the 1700s list for us.
But understanding how much Pat has got involved with so many different plants. I mean, you look there and he's talking about all these different maples he wants to share signwood with J.D. Vertrees and trading signwood.
Right.
And this is back in the day, and, Pat has been at our place trading signwood, and we've been trading Pat.
These are people we look up to and love seeing them show up in some of these archives as well. One fun thing I noticed was we found a very early Buchholz and Buchholz catalog. So Talon was kind of excited to see that one as well, and we took some copies of that and made some copies of it. But it was like a paper print early rendition of the Buchholz catalog.
And one of the people that showed up here not too long ago, was in these correspondence was Billy Schwartz. Now, Billy Schwartz, if people don't know who that is, we've got a full podcast with Billy Schwartz. He
definitely go watch that one.
Yeah, he's an amazing character who has a lot of history with Rara Flora Nursery, but then he learned a lot from Dick Wolf at Red Maple Nursery.
That's our Joe Rogan episode.
It
goes off the rails a little bit. So if you want some maples and some crazy pieces of history from Billy Schwartz, definitely go check that out. He talks about a Muhammad Ali fight fix. He talks about a lot of crazy stuff, but you'll want to see that one. It's interesting.
So the guy he learned under, Dick Wolf, who introduced Emperor One, just to give you an idea of who he learned underneath. And Billy Schwartz, his daughter is Shayna, with the trees named after, that's all around the world. I mean, Billy Schwartz is a legend when it comes to maples, and here he's mailing back and forth with J.D. Vertrees, talking about new seedlings he's found.
Yeah,
and he's
an interesting guy.
He's saying, I was at Red Maple Nurseries and I found this seedling from Shikaratsu Sawa that has much smaller foliage. And I'm thinking to myself, where is this tree today?
Right.
It gets me to start asking some questions now with Billy and say, man, I'm going to start tracking down some of these plants he's talking about.
I'm going to have to go march around the grounds there at Red Maple Nurseries in search of a few more things that have been lost to time. It's so interesting. Bill, these guys are larger than life. They're really interesting people. I mean, you go watch our videos we have on YouTube about Red Maple Nurseries. We talk a lot about Dick Wolf and his collections. I mean, the guy's named Emperor One, Red Dragon. I mean, his list is, you put that up against anybody's. It's pretty groundbreaking stuff. And J.D. Vertrees was corresponding with him very early on. They're comparing notes. They're saying, what do you think about this? And, he's saying, guy, we got to get a book out on this. Like, when's your book coming to the J.D. Vertrees? And so, a lot of these guys are encouraging Vertrees to get an English book out there. A lot of these nurserymen, especially, because it only benefits the entire industry when there is this kind of a resource for them. And so, He's looking at their notes, they're looking at his notes, and those correspondence are so interesting. They're very personable. They're often like, I'm writing to you at this late hour, and I'm so tired. I've been up reading all of your recent notes on Acer sercinatum's viability in Pennsylvania and things like that. And so it's so interesting. But these guys were huge fans of each other. Is really what I want to get at there. It's really interesting, and Dick Wolf being such a larger than life personality, I'm sure had a huge impact on JD Vertrees.
I just was shocked by how many plant legends were in these correspondence.
Right.
We're talking about Tim Brontzman, one of the top witch hazel guys in the world. We're talking about Jane Platt. She's got Platt Gardens. She is such a famous gardens in Portland. And it's just known as one of the classic gardens there in Portland that everyone goes and visits. And there's so many plants that have been named out of the Platt Garden. If you've seen Platt's Dwarf or different names of plants that have Platt in the name, it came from that garden there in Portland. And we even saw Dan Himes, owner of Terra Nova Nurseries.
Check out our podcast with Dan Himes.
He introduced so many cool plants, including some maples that you may have in your garden, such as Ever Autumn or Ruby Ridge. And in this, Dan Himes is writing a letter to JD Vertrees, basically telling him of this sercinatum possible hybrid that he's found. And I would assume that it would possibly be Ever Autumn that he's discussing.
Maybe.
Because in it, he discusses how it shows a fall color like thing throughout the season. And Ever Autumn with a name like that would very well tie into this. And seeing these pieces of plant history of this correspondence is just shocking.
He had a note to Isley, and Isley had written him and said, "Hey, I just bought Oro Green Nursery. We're really looking to kind of make our place look a little bit better with some of the stuff you do. We'd like to bring in some of your maples to really beef things up here and make things look prettier and really add a lot of curb appeal to what we're doing. How can we work with you on this?" And then their following letters are kind of funny. I mean, you're reading letters between guys like Dick Wolf and Isley and Vertrees. And, I won't out anybody, but on a funny level, they're talking about places that do things right and do things wrong. And there's still places around today that do things right and do things wrong. And they're like, yeah, that guy just mixes everything up. Be careful with him. Oh, that's a great customer. And you see places that are still great customers of us today on that list. And you're like, man, that's pretty cool.
And these correspondents weren't just here in the United States. We're talking worldwide. I mean, there was letters there with him and Jelena de Belder of Calmute Arboretum. And Jelena sounds familiar to you. You may have or know of the cultivar of Hamamelis called Hamamelis Jelena. And that was named after Jelena de Belder. And she's writing JD Vertrees telling him about a pink seedling that she has in her garden that she thinks needs to be further evaluated.
Right.
And we're seeing these correspondence from people all around the world. And it just gets more and more interesting the more you dig into it.
Yeah, I've been to Calmute Arboretum. It's amazing. I didn't go during witch hazel season. The maples are incredible. Maybe we need to go do another walk through there. That place is incredible. It's a private garden. And Diane is actually the red Hamamelis, I believe named for her sister. I'm not sure, but it's also named at the same place. They've got Acer Sercinatum, Calmute, and many other interesting plants grown there on the grounds. There was so many interesting things. Now, Vertrees worked with several different mail order outlets. He was grafting around 5,000 different Japanese maples or grafts a year at his peak, and somewhere around 260 different cultivars, according to most of his notes. And he was basically only open by appointment, which we understand here a lot, and then doing mail order through various outlets. I don't think he was physically mailing them most of the time himself. And some of those places he started out with didn't always work out, so he changed around a little bit. There were some different people he used. There was a lot of interesting correspondence with Art Wright, who you know as the guy who kind of helped push Green Cascade out there. He was a propagator for Vertrees as well. In one of his notes to him, he says, "Hey, I've registered this cultivar Green Cascade and give you credit for the name. I really like it, and I've put it at the Arnold Arboretum. At Harvard, you should definitely receive credit and introduction for Green Cascade."
Guys, there's so many cool things. One of the things that really struck me was this thing that I learned about through these notes was the red filigree lace saga. Now, guys, there's drama in everything. And apparently there was a lot of drama around the original red filigree lace.
This was going to be the groundbreaking thing at the time. So they had contracts drawn up to specific producers, and they said, it was very detailed stuff. In fact, maybe we could learn a few things from these guys. They had very detailed descriptions. It wasn't a patented plant, but they said, if you're going to be producing it, this is for how long you'll be producing it. And this is for how long you'll be, calling it this way. And we're going to evaluate it for this long before it's released. And it was really interesting stuff to get into.
So I found this letter from J.D. Vertrees to Dave Wagner that said, I believe the red filigree is the most outstanding dissectum cultivar to be discovered in many years. You will find little history of it in the book. The history is not complete, since there were additional changes after the book was in print. The seedling was germinated by Will Curtis. If even if you all have ever seen Acer palmatum dissectum Curtis, that's also where that one originated as well. He gave the seedling to Mr. Goddard of Victoria, British Columbia, who raised it for several years and only propagated it with 1 or 2 additional plants. A few years later, Goddard sold the mother plant to John Mitch. He said, Vertrees said, I grafted everything for John for a couple years, but none has ever been sold while he was trying to build up cell stock. And he said, it was a very small stem thing and very difficult to propagate, which many nurserymen know is still true today. I mean, red filigree lace is one of the more difficult traits to graft. In January of 1978, John sold the older plants and all of the grafts to Isley Nursery. They are propagating it like mad. And this is where the drama really, really begins. And it got to be this real interesting thing where J.D. Vertrees had plants at his home, and he asked Isley Nursery, and he said, I want to protect all of your interest, but I think we need to make this available to collectors as well, which will continue to build hype on this tree. And so, like Matt said, they wrote out these contracts, and they had priced where these plants could only be sold for X amount of dollars. And these were high prices back then.
For back then, that was big money.
I mean, those would be high prices today.
Higher than we sell plants for.
And everyone that bought a plant had to sign a contract that for 2 years, nothing would be grafted or propagated off of their red filigree laces. That way, Isley Nursery, John Isley, and then their financial interest in buying red filigree lace could be protected, and they could get it out to the mass market through Isley Nursery. And it was so interesting seeing this because we could see the contracts of the, close to 20 people that had bought red filigree lace from J.D. Vertrees. And one of them was even D.M. Van Gelderen in Holland. And I was like, wow, this is pieces of history right here. But then, drum roll, what ended up happening was some plants ended up being stolen from Isley Nursery. And I mean, this plant had built so much hype around it. People were like, man, there's nothing else like this tree. It's got these extremely dissected foliage. It looks just like feathers. I mean, this thing is amazing. And then someone came in and stole the plant. And they stole a few stock plants from it. And shortly thereafter came out Acer palmatum dissectum ruby lace.
Yeah, so it's heavily debated even amongst some of those old school guys. Talon says, maybe people found similar genetics, maybe they didn't. I mean, he actually probably believes it is the same. So it's highly debated whether that was a copy of red filigree or whether somebody found something similar.
I know when Matt and I got to go visit
around the time one was stolen.
I know when Matt and I got to go visit Del Laux, we knew nothing about this red filigree lace saga, but we'd saw a red filigree lace liner at Del Laux, and then he said, now that is different than ruby lace. I saw the original ruby lace at so-and-so's plant and blah, blah, blah. So it's a very contentious thing. Is ruby lace the same as red filigree lace? There has been other selections found that are similar. Like I know that red feathers was found at Nancy Vermeulen's place underneath the original burgundy lace.
And I find it to be distinctly different. Like it does green up a little bit in heavy shade. There's some differences between it and red filigree. Red filigree will actually hold its color in heavy dense shade. So we know that one to be distinctly, on its own, even though it was ripped off and called Riley's red feather as well. Same plant. I guess people always rename plants. I guess that's the moral of the story.
But it was crazy to see all this drama all around red filigree lace, and then them they're not emailing, but mailing each other back and forth and saying, these plants were stolen. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And then, we've seen this coming out on the trade. So it was crazy to see all this drama around plants. even back in the day. And it was even titled in the catalog of things, the Red Filigree Lace Saga. And I was like, what in the world is this?
I found one thing that I found really interesting. Like I said, I got into the book with Dick Wolf and DM Van Gelderen correspondence with like an hour to go. Kind of broke my heart there a little bit. I was like, man, I should have started with this. This is where all the gold's at. So there are a lot of interesting cultivar notes. Like he says, in ancient Japanese, this may be the same as this. This may be the same as this. In the late 70s, he was, or maybe even late 80s, he was telling DM Van Gelderen, I consider there to be no conceivable difference right now between Waterfall and Veritas. He said at one point they were separate, but now in the trade they have become the exact same thing. Interesting to see him make that observation, 30 plus years ago, and he said that basically Veritas had become a group for dissectums, and at one point there was a distinctive Veritas in the trade, but now there's no conceivable difference between Veritas and Waterfall. And that's a realization we've kind of had here at our nursery. We still list them separately because people look for them separately, but in our description we say, hey, there's no real difference between these two. So it was kind of nice to get that confirmation of our own findings.
And it was interesting because JD Vertrees was sharing Scions and sharing cultivars with people all around the United States, not just through selling plants, but he was giving sign wood of Kamagata and a lot of his own introductions just to get them out there in the nursery trade. And it was cool to see this from a guy who, was so busy, so swamped, but yet found time to share with others and introduce so many cool plants and write this book.
He was really cheerleading all these different people on. I use that term to just say encouraging. I mean, he was writing all these different places from Texas to Minnesota and saying, hey, maybe you can grow Japanese maples. He was sending sercinatum seedlings everywhere saying, look through these genetics. He was contacting everybody willing to grow a seedling and saying, hey, what are you finding? And it was interesting stuff too. You'd find correspondence where he said, hey, I've seen a picture of a tree that you may have named Corallinum. Could you give me some signs of this? I'm interested in comparing this to other cultivars. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff too, where he's basically reaching out to people looking for individual cultivars in Holland, in the UK, all over, in New Zealand. There was a ton of correspondence with New Zealand and just interesting places. And these are some of the main places still around the globe for Japanese maples. And so he was really reaching out to the places that are still very prominent Japanese maple hubs, if you will, around the planet.
It's interesting to see what people had to do to get their hands on certain Japanese maple selections back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there wasn't a MrMaple.com where you could just go sign up to be notified when it comes back in stock.
We're making it easy, guys.
You had to search these things out, send physical letters out to people, and kind of beg them for certain plants, and then convince them to mail them to you. I mean, this is a completely different world than what we live in today.
I ran out of time too on the film. There was a lot of stuff that was on film, and I basically got this like light thing you could put on the table and it glows through, and then you could throw the little discs on and kind of see what was in the pictures. But there were interesting original photos of cultivars that didn't make it into the book, and some did from Vertrees. There were also documents he'd obtained in Japanese that there's only these tile copies now of, so we could kind of throw some of those on that light board and get a little 2x2 inch image of a preview of what that slide might show if you go and put it on a projector. And it was pretty cool just to kind of live in that world, to interact with the things that JD Vertrees touched, to look through his personal notes, to look through his stuff, and just kind of put yourself a little bit in those shoes and kind of think about what this guy was doing when he was really helping popularize Japanese maples all around the world.
I think the most exciting thing for us exactly was learning who JD Vertrees was, how he interacted with people, who he interacted with, and really understanding everything he had to work through to make this book on Japanese maples. And Matt and I have always revered JD Vertrees with a high regard because of all the work that he did with the book. And that's where our passion has came from, is digging in and learning more and looking through the book almost like a wish list and saying, wow, we need to get that cultivar in and see how it does. Wow, we need to learn about that. Wow, I'd like to grow that one too. And so going through his notes was really just something special to us personally. I mean,
A lot of people probably don't realize this too, but Tim and I mean, you definitely realize this if you're a fan. We love the history. Like, we love the history. You definitely realize that if you're a follower of this channel. So, funny thing to say, but you definitely realize that we love the stories about the people and the stories behind the people. Uh, I was originally going to be a history teacher. I don't have a horticulture degree. I have a history degree. So this is right up my alley, doing some research, and it's just super fun. We love the stories about the people, and I think it only adds to the trees when you know who, what, where, when, and why.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, guys, we really appreciate you jumping in today and doing this extra tree geeky thing and learning about JD Vertrees and the guy, the man, the myth, the legend who started this Japanese maple passion that many of y'all may have now that we definitely got.
We all owe him a huge debt of gratitude. There's no Japanese maple trend in the late 80s and early 90s without this guy really spearheading it and putting together the first English book on Japanese maples. I mean, don't underestimate the importance of this. This was read around the world. I mean, English is a common second language everywhere, and this really brought the whole genre of Japanese maples to the forefront.
Well, if you love this type of content, make sure you're subscribed to us on your favorite podcast platform, but also check us out on YouTube. We air our YouTube version of this every Sunday at 8 p.m. You can get involved in the live chat there as well. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, we put out daily content there for you, mostly on Japanese maples, definitely on gardening. It's something you'll really enjoy.
Guys, if it isn't up now, it'll be up soon. We're doing a deeper dive. I mentioned it before, but we go through JD Vertrees' collection. We go to his actual home and we look at several of the trees that are still there. And it was just a special thing to see. So if you liked this podcast, you made it this far, you definitely want to check out that video. It's a fun accompaniment to kind of see the actual trees that Vertrees was growing and the ones that kind of shaped Japanese maple history. We hope you'll go to your favorite podcast platform and sub the Mr. Maple Show. Give us 5 stars. And if we've earned it, guys, definitely subscribe to our channel. It's a great way to get informed about Japanese maples. We add at least 10 new trees every single Tuesday at 10 on MrMaple.com. So we make it a little bit easier than these guys in the 70s to find all the cool new things. You don't have to sign any contracts. You can just get notified and then check out with the cool stuff when you're ready.
So take care.
God bless.
And have an awesome day.